Every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Great.com is a philanthropic project where we're donating 100% of the profit towards the most effective cause areas like protecting the rainforest, funding climate change technology. And the best thing that you can do to help us in this mission would be to subscribe to this channel. Today, the topic is, what does it mean to donate effectively, and why don't more people act upon giving effectively? So I want to understand more about this, and today we have invited Stefan Schubert, who is a researcher at the Social Behaviour and Ethics Lab at the University of Oxford. So I want to say, Stefan, welcome to this interview.
Thank you very much, Spirit. I'm happy to be here.
Stefan, help us understand what is effective altruism and how come you became interested in doing research in this field?
Right, yeah. So effective altruism, this is sort of a combination of two ideas. So the first idea is sort of the altruistic part, that we should allocate some of our resources to others, whether it be money or like part of our time. So like, that we should do good with our career and so on. So that's the altruism part. But then the other part is the effectiveness part, that we should use this money that we allocate to others effectively. And that's maybe something that altruists haven't focused so much. Like lots of discourse about altruism has been around that we should sort of increase the amount that we allocate to others, like the amount of resources. But it's also very important that those resources are used effectively. So that's maybe what effective altruism is most known for, its sort of most salient feature.
And somewhere here in your life, you decided that you want to start to research the effectiveness of the altruism. How did that start?
Yeah, it's a long story. I guess so. I'm a philosopher. That's my primary background. So I did a PhD on sort of rationality in general, like questions of like how should we act, and how can we gain justified beliefs, and what should we do to acquire justified beliefs. And then I found this community, the effective altruists, that were sort of trying to apply rationality in practice in order to do good, and that excited me a lot because when I did philosophy, I was always a bit frustrated that there were lots of very smart people who were using their sophisticated thoughts on sort of maybe not always the most important questions, so that they didn't apply philosophy in the real world. So I was excited that effective altruists did that, and then eventually I started working for a Center for Effective Altruism here in Oxford, where I live. So that's sort of like the central body of the effective altruism movement. I did research for them for 2 years, but then I left there, and then I joined my colleague Lucia Saviola here, who worked here at Oxford, to sort of study why people don't donate effectively or otherwise are affected. Because so there's, I guess, like some sort of psychological obstacles that stand in the way of people being effectively altruistic. And we want to understand those obstacles better in order to eventually be able to overcome them, or to sort of help more people overcoming them.
Now I'm curious, help us, tell us, what does that obstacle look like?
What those obstacles are? Yeah, so I think one key insight here is that there are sort of multiple such obstacles. So often when people talk about like ineffective giving, they pinpoint like one obstacle. So they say that, like, you know, some people are a bit cynical. Maybe they say, well, it's just that people want to show off, you know, that they're altruistic, like, so that's why they donate, and they don't actually care about impact. They just care about showing off. So that's why they donate ineffectively. So some people say that. Other people say, well, it's actually that they have, you know, false beliefs about which charities are effective, and sort of other, they suffer from other misconceptions. And still other people say that, well, people just feel very strongly for specific charities because maybe they have a personal connection to them. And there are sort of, you know, still other causes that people point to. And we are saying that, like, lots of the time, people actually have many obstacles that prevent them from donating effectively. So we did one study where we asked participants sort of a number of questions. So questions like, would you donate to a local charity or to a foreign charity? Yeah, let's just take that one. And then, like, part of the reason why people often prioritize local charities over charities in distant countries, in poor countries, is that they actually believe that that is more effective. But usually that's not the case. It's like, usually you can help people in very poor countries more with the same amount of money than people in the US, for instance, because, like, you know, people in very poor countries, they sort of lack very basic necessities, which, you know, typically even poor people in the US don't lack. So that's, like, part of the reason that there's, like, false beliefs about what's actually effective. But then we also told some participants, like, well, you know, this foreign charity is more effective, and they believed us, but they still went on, you know, giving to the local charity because that's what they preferred, like that, what they, you know, they feel more of a connection with their local community. And we call this paper then the many obstacles to effective giving. We demonstrated also many other obstacles, but this is just to say that in general, it seems that there are multiple obstacles to effective giving, and in particular, there are the false beliefs and then sort of preferences for specific ineffective charities. And that sort of explains why it's so hard to, you know, help people donating effectively, because, like, just overcoming one obstacle may not be enough, and there are other obstacles still there.
Super interesting to understand that even if you open the key to one door, there might still be doors that you need to open to.
Exactly, that's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Then why would it be important to have the collective to understand effective donations? So how much is the difference if you are effective or not?
Yeah, that's actually another thing that people don't know, and probably another reason why they donate ineffectively. So we have another paper where we asked people, what do you think is the difference between the most effective charities? And we looked then specifically on charities that work on global poverty and health. So what's the difference between the most effective such charities and the typical or average such charity? And yeah, like, I mean, the listener might think for themselves, what do you think? So, you know, just take a guess.
Let me be the listener then. Let me just take a guess. I would say one of the most effective would be like a big organization that has a big reach, maybe like WWF, Worldwide Animal Foundation, or
right. But the question is, like,
Greenpeace.
what's the difference in sort of yeah, like in terms of percentages or so.
Okay, then I'm going to take a guess before I understood effective altruism, and I would say 10 times difference.
Okay.
Or maybe 4 times different. Maybe 10 times is too much.
Okay. Okay, but then you were actually better than the average participant here, because like the average participant in our studies thought that the difference was between like, 50 to 100%. So like, between 1.5 and twice as effective. Whereas like we asked experts, global poverty experts, and they on average thought that the difference was 100 times. So you were sort of in between here. Like you thought there was like, well, 4 was your final answer, but I was like closer at least than like to the real answer, which or the best real answer that we have, which is 100. Whereas like most people think it's like 1.5 or 2. So anyway, so this means that sort of people underestimate the difference in charity effectiveness between charities. And that means that they sort of also underestimate the importance of finding the most effective charities. So like, because there are these huge differences, it's like very, very important that you find the most effective charities and that you donate to them. And it's, yeah, I should also add that, like I said, we looked at global poverty charities, but it's well possible that like if you compare different cause areas, so like charities working in rich countries with global poverty charities, then the differences in effectiveness would be even greater. But we haven't looked at that, but that seems reasonable.
So you're saying people believe it's twice as effective, but in reality it's over 100 times more effective if you're doing the study and research where to donate. That makes sense. So if I would invest my money in the stock market, I would of course do research before I invested, because I want to make it effective. And if I could get 100% more from my money,
100 times more, yeah.
100 times more.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good analogy. So which we often use. Like we say like, well, when people are making big consumption decisions for themselves, like they buy a car or they buy a house, they of course like do research and they try to get the most value for money, right? And similarly, when they make investment decisions, they do some amount of research and they try, to get the best investments, to make the best investments that they can. But they don't quite have the same attitude when it comes to charity. And like one reason, like which other studies have found, not our studies, but other studies, they found that like some people think that, well, that's not my responsibility. Like, the charities should be effective, which, one might think is like an understandable reaction, but unfortunately, that kind of attitude leads to money not necessarily going to the most effective charities, because, I think this is also related to a misunderstanding that like many people think that ineffectiveness comes from sort of fraud or charities trying to enrich themselves or having too large overheads and so on. But that's not really the case. Like, you can have a very low overhead and still be very ineffective because you're working on a problem which is just very difficult to make progress on. And such charities, they often continue to get money from donors, and they are of course like motivated to continue raising money. Like they of course think that this problem is important, which is like natural and human. But in any case, this means that like you can't really have that attitude as a donor to just expect that the charities to sort of fix this problem of charity ineffectiveness for you. Like you have to take on responsibility yourself and find effective charities and decide to donate to them.
I guess one of those obstacles, I'm just assuming, would be trust. Like even if someone says, yeah, it's 100 times more effective to donate to this organization, how can I trust you? So where would you recommend people where you actually, what would be your best call to find trustworthy sources on the best effective charities?
Yeah, okay, so that's an interesting point, actually. Like, so one thing I haven't really sort of emphasized, but which I should emphasize, is that like all of these numbers about, which I've now given about, like, you know, some charities being 100 times more effective than others, they sort of, there's a lot of uncertainty about them. So these experts that we asked, they actually disagreed a bit about, like, you know, what the difference in effectiveness is. But I think it's fair to say that, like, generally they thought that the difference in effectiveness is much greater than what, you know, most donors think, most lay people think. So there is clearly like a qualitative difference there, or there is really clearly a difference there, but there is some uncertainty of, like, you know, how big it is. So I mean, like, so there's one site which is called GiveWell, which has recommended global poverty charities in particular for many years, and you know, their research is generally well regarded, and then there are also these like effective altruism funds where you can, there's one fund for global poverty, so there's one on animal welfare and one on the long-term future or the far future, I think, and maybe some more as well. So where sort of they have sort of fund managers who decide where to give away their money, and they're also generally well regarded. But that's all of this said, like, yeah, it is kind of a tricky issue. Like, you know, if you ideally, like, you know, you should look at these websites yourself and like try to get to an understanding, and you should ask other people whom you trust and so on. But I guess that's also like the same with any other sort of big decision regarding you know, your own consumption or your investments. Like, it's difficult to find out like who is really trustworthy, and there's like no like there's no sort of easy formulas for how to do it.
I guess the science that the research and science that you're working on, it's showcasing that right now there's a gap in this sector where on how we think as a species. What happens with this research? What do we? Why is it important to do this kind of research?
Yeah, so from my perspective and from the effective altruism perspective, it's sort of important to make people you know, donate more effectively, and otherwise do be more effective with the resources that they're allocating to others, because like ultimately we want to make the world a better place to as large an extent as possible and as quickly as possible. So that's why effectiveness matters. Effectiveness matters because like people's well-being, it matters because it matters to reduce suffering in the world, which seems like a, you know, relatively uncontroversial view. But then, like, why our research specifically matters? Well, that's, you know, the ultimate goal is to sort of contribute, like, by understanding these obstacles to effective giving, we could sort of help overcoming them and cause more effective donations, and also other forms of effectively altruistic actions, like effective career choice and so on.
I'm thinking you're proving something that is known in the effective altruism community, that we are not yet effective. and you're just proving this by the research that you're doing?
Well, we are demonstrating it, but it's more like we're trying to understand the causal mechanism, like what exactly are the causes of the ineffectiveness. I agree, like, you can just observe where people are donating, and it's like, it's clear that they're not usually being effective when they're donating. But what's less known then is like exactly why that is, and what the causes are, and that's what we're trying to understand, and also then to come up with ideas for how to solve this problem.
Stefan, if I understood you correct, you are I'm shifting a little bit geared here. A part of effective altruism is also to both that the donation is going to be effective, but also the cause that we're donating towards, that that is in the same thing. But if we talk about the cause, there's different causes. What causes right now do you think are effective to look into?
Yeah, so that's sort of a topic which I have opinions on, but sort of like outside of my primary areas of expertise. But so I personally think that sort of making sure that the humanity's long-term future becomes as good as possible, that's the cause that I find the most important, the highest impact. And then the next question is, of course, like, how exactly can you influence the long-term future? And there, effective altruists have had different ideas, but maybe the most popular way of influencing the long-term future is to make sure that there actually is a future, to sort of prevent human extinction or collapse from civilizational collapse that we couldn't recover from. So this is something that philosopher Nick Bostrom has called like existential risks. So we want to reduce existential risk to make sure that the long-term future is still there, so that future people can make sure that it becomes as good as possible.
And when I just out of my mind think of existential risk, I'm thinking climate change, AI security, nuclear safety, and pandemic safety, how to research and make sure we don't any of those would not make us go extinct. Probably there are more existential risks.
Yeah, like there is actually an excellent book that came out last year, The Precipice, by Toby Ord at the Future of Humanity Institute here in Oxford. And Toby lists all of these different risks, and then he actually tries, like it's very bold, like but I think correctly, like he's trying to give sort of quantitative estimates of like how large all of these risks are. I don't remember the exact numbers now, but I think he puts like AI risk as the greatest risk, and then I think engineered pandemics is also something that he puts as quite big risk. So engineered pandemics, they're not pandemics like COVID, which at least that's what people think. It's like not engineered or synthetically, but it's a sort of has arisen by itself. But like in the future, people worry that it could be that people create synthetic viruses which might be more infectious and more lethal and so on than currently existing viruses, and that could potentially pose an existential risk.
I guess the tricky part here being listening to this and just hearing, okay, so now I'm hearing AI security and what was the second thing you said there?
Biosafety.
Biosafety. then we should allocate resources and energy towards that. But then again, if that gets a lot of resources, then maybe that is not even that is not the most effective place to go. So I guess this would shift. If we had said 5 years ago, we would for sure have said climate change maybe. But now, because climate change has gotten a lot of attention, maybe that going down on the list of where should I do my contribution? How should people think when it comes to
yeah. I mean, that's a very good question, actually. So the effective altruists, they have created this framework for identifying the highest impact causes. And it has sort of three factors. So like when you're trying to find a cause or a problem that you're trying to solve, then you should first look at the problem's importance. That is like, how much better would the world become if you solve the problem? It's, a very obvious criterion. And the second one is sort of its solvability. Is it solvable or not? If it's not solvable, that's reason against working on it. So, okay, that's quite obvious as well. But the third one is less obvious, and that's like its neglectedness. So, and that's sort of what you're referring to here. Like, if lots of people already are working on a problem, then additional resources that go into them might, not make as much of a difference as if like, very few people are working on. It's actually like a little bit difficult sometimes to work out like exactly what the effects of neglectedness are, but like as a general rule, I think that's true, that like the first people who work on a problem, they sort of address the most glaring omissions, right? So, and they're sort of picking the lowest hanging fruit. And then when that sort of lowest hanging fruit has been picked, you can still make a difference, but usually less so. So, and, it's right that this means that what is the highest impact cause at one point might not remain the highest impact cause at the later point, because like now so many people have invested in that problem. However, I should add one thing, and this sort of like relates to this, what we talked about with sort of ineffective giving and so on. So there is a difference here between sort of the donation market, as it were, and the standard stock market. Because like if a stock or like a company is like very undervalued, then it will usually not remain so very long, because like money will just flood in, and that sort of opportunity to make lots of profits from investing in the company will sort of disappear very quickly, because investors are very effectiveness minded. They're set on profit maximization. But because donors aren't as focused on effectiveness or on sort of impact maximization, then they won't to the same extent sort of take those opportunities. And that means that they can often sort of remain for a long period of time. But that might actually change, like, if effective altruism becomes more popular, then we might get sort of more of a sort of efficient donation market. But I don't think we're there yet.
So one priority would be to advocate for just more efficiency, kind of like what we're doing with this interview.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going towards the end here, and I would like to know, is there other things that you think is important that you want to highlight from the research that you're doing that you want people to be aware of?
So, yeah, I mean, I've also actually done research on the psychology of existential risk as well. So we have one paper on that. I'm not sure whether we have enough time to go.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so the thing here is that, like, people think in general that sort of big catastrophes are very bad, obviously. But, the claim from philosophers like Bostrom that I mentioned, and there's this late Oxford philosopher Derek Parfit, who did research on existential risk as well. And they've argued that there is something sort of uniquely bad about existential risk, because not only would it kill lots of people immediately, but it would also mean that humanity's future would forever be lost if we went extinct. And it seems that people, they don't always sort of distinguish between like catastrophes that don't lead to extinction, or like existential catastrophes, and existential catastrophes. So Parfit, he has this thought experiment where, and which we studied, and we tweaked his thought experiment a bit. So I'm going to tell you the tweaked version. So we have three scenarios. So one is there's no catastrophe at all. The second is there's a catastrophe that kills 80% of everyone on Earth, or all people on Earth. And then the third outcome is that there's a catastrophe that kills 100% of everyone. So then we asked people, following Parfit, like, which do you think is the worst and which do you think is the best of these outcomes? And that was just a preliminary question. Of course, people thought that like, no one dying was the best and everyone dying was the worst, and like 80% was in between. But the more difficult and interesting question was like, which difference is the greater? The difference between no one dying and 80% dying, or between 80% dying and 100% dying. So Parfit had predicted that in situations like this, people would think that the difference in sort of moral badness between no one dying and 80% dying, they would judge that difference to be greater than that between 80% dying and 100% dying. But he himself, he thought that the second difference is greater because only 100% dying would lead to humanity forever losing its future, whereas we could recover from a catastrophe that kills 80%. So we effectively sort of tested Parfit's hypothesis, and it turned out that he was right. Like, most people did think that this first difference between no one dying and 80% dying is sort of the greater one in terms of moral badness. And that is probably because like people look at the number of deaths and they don't look at sort of long-term consequences. And and then we did some sort of follow-up experiments where we sort of reminded people to think about the long-term consequences. And then actually more people did think that the difference between extinction and sort of near extinction was the more important difference. Anyway, this sort of demonstrates that people might not sort of intuitively think about the long-term consequences of human extinction, and therefore might sort of underestimate how bad it is.
Yeah, that shifts perspective. I've heard so far humanity has lived 11,000 generations or something like that, maybe more, maybe less, not sure. So if we then look in the future thinking that we're actually losing 11,000 generations, that shifts the whole ballpark on.
For sure, and there could be many more than 11,000, and the number of people on Earth will be greater in the future than it was for most of humanity's history, of course. So,
so that, I guess, would add complexity to the whole idea of effective altruism, that there's more perspectives to take in, and shifting. I'm kind of hearing long-term thinking in the whole effective altruism.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think that's also something that is like, there's a bit of a difference between the sort of public image of effective altruism and how discussions are like now, like in which direction discussions are now heading within the movement. So the sort of public image is that it is largely focused on sort of problems that are happening today, like global poverty and so on. And certainly there are many people in the movement that are focused on that. But I think that like this interest in the long-term future and existential risk has grown and grown, and is now like a very important part of effective altruism.
Stefan, we are close to the end. Any last thing that you want to, a message that you want to end this interview with?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great if listeners who aren't already familiar with effective altruism could sort of, go out online and try to find out more information on, I think it's called effectivealtruism.org, or like the 80,000 Hours podcast is also like a great place to learn more about effective altruism.
Thank you very much for taking the time helping us to understand this complex but rewarding topic.